5:29 a.m., July 16, 1945. The New Mexico desert. A thin man in a leather jacket stands at ground zero, chain smoking. J. Robert Oppenheimer hasn't slept in days. His creation, the atomic bomb, is about to be tested. His hands shake as he lights another cigarette. 10, 9, 8. In these final seconds, he still believes this is just another scientific achievement. 3, 2, 1. The flash turns night into day. As the mushroom cloud rises, Oppenheimer sees something no one else does. A glimpse of the future, cities burning, shadows of people burned into walls, generations living under the threat of annihilation. In this moment, he remembers an ancient Hindu text. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He thinks the hard part is over. He's wrong. This isn't the end of his story. It's the beginning of his nightmare. His greatest triumph is about to become his greatest torment. You might think being the father of the atomic bomb brought glory, but for Oppenheimer, it meant spending the rest of his life haunted by the ghosts of his own genius. This is the story of a man who changed the world and spent every day after wishing he could take it back. Before we dive into this story, let me tell you about a different Oppenheimer. In 1926, he was just a brilliant young physicist in Europe, studying quantum mechanics and reading Sanskrit poetry in his spare time. His colleagues called him Oppie. He wore fashionable suits, quoted Hindu scripture, and dreamed about understanding the universe, not destroying cities. But by 1943, this same man would be leading the most destructive scientific project in human history. And unlike other scientists who could later distance themselves from their work, Oppenheimer's combination of scientific brilliance and philosophical insight meant he understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what he had unleashed upon the world. Over the next few minutes, we'll see how this understanding became his curse, how his attempts to prevent even worse weapons cost him everything, and how he spent his final years haunted by the very achievement that made him famous. If you're fascinated by how brilliant minds grapple with the consequences of their discoveries, hit subscribe. We're creating a whole series about great scientists who saw their work change the world and wish they could take it back. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's start in April 1943. Oppenheimer is recruiting the brilliant minds who will help him build the atomic bomb. But there's something unique about his position. He has to convince his friends to join a project he knows will end in mass civilian casualties. Years later, he would write in his private diary, "I have blood on the hands of good friends. I led them into this moral nightmare with talk of scientific achievement." Unlike other project leaders who could focus purely on the technical challenges, Oppenheimer's broader education meant he understood the moral implications from the very beginning. Consider this letter he wrote to his brother. "Sometimes I see the reactions in the equations, and instead of elegant physics, I see cities burning." This wasn't just scientific work for him. It was a Faustian bargain he was making on behalf of everyone he recruited. But the real torment began with the Trinity test. While other scientists focused on collecting data, Oppenheimer was experiencing something entirely different. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian of the Manhattan Project, explains, "What made Oppenheimer unique was his immediate grasp of the moral implications. While other scientists were calculating blast yields, he was quoting the Bhagavad Gita. He wasn't just seeing an explosion, he was seeing the future." His extensive study of Eastern philosophy, particularly Hindu texts, gave him a framework for understanding mass destruction that his purely scientific colleagues lacked. As one colleague later noted, "While we saw physics, Oppie saw karma." The weeks following Hiroshima and Nagasaki were even worse. While America celebrated, Oppenheimer kept a private tally of the dead, updating it as new reports came in. He would later tell his secretary that he saw the shadows of Hiroshima, victims in his dreams, burned into walls just like the actual shadows left by the blast. Has knowledge ever become a burden for you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. When does understanding something make it harder to live with? But perhaps the most tragic part of Oppenheimer's story was what happened when he tried to prevent something even worse. By October 1945, he was meeting with President Truman about the future of atomic weapons. This meeting would change everything. While others might have stayed quiet, Oppenheimer's conscience forced him to speak up. He told the president, "I have blood on my hands." Truman's response? He called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist and ordered his staff never to let him in the White House again. In one moment, the most influential scientist in America lost all ability to influence nuclear policy. But he couldn't stop trying. When the hydrogen bomb was proposed, Oppenheimer called it evil and fought against its development. His opposition made him suspicious to military leaders. By 1954, this led to the most public humiliation of a scientist in American history. The security hearings were brutal. Over 40 witnesses testified across 4 weeks. Former friends testified against him, including Edward Teller, whose testimony about Oppenheimer's poor judgment effectively ended their friendship. His past was twisted into evidence of disloyalty. Even his interest in Eastern philosophy was used to question his American values. Even his personal life, including his former fiance's suicide and his brother's communist connections, was used to attack him. His hands shook so badly during testimony that he couldn't hold his pipe. When the final verdict came, stripping him of his security clearance, Oppenheimer learned about it from reporters who called for comment. He would later describe this period as a continuing humiliation. If you're finding this exploration of moral courage and its price fascinating, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these important historical stories. But perhaps the most painful part of Oppenheimer's story was how the burden of knowledge followed him everywhere, not just into government hearings, but into his most private moments. In 1965, he agreed to a filmed interview about the atomic bomb. The footage is heartbreaking. When asked about the victims, he breaks down. "I need a break," he says, visibly shaking, before walking off camera. Unlike other Manhattan Project scientists who could distance themselves, Oppenheimer became the face of scientific moral responsibility. The burden affected his entire family. His daughter attempted suicide in 1954. His son struggled with his father's legacy. Oppenheimer himself developed throat cancer, likely from his chain-smoking habit that had intensified after the Trinity test. In his final days, visitors reported that he would stare out his hospital window for hours. One nurse recorded that he would sometimes reach out to touch the glass, as if trying to hold back something only he could see. His last coherent words were reportedly, "Still those flames," followed by a Sanskrit phrase from the Gita that his brother Frank translated as "in battle, in the forest, at the precipice in the mountains, on the dark great sea, in the midst of javelins and arrows, in sleep, in confusion, in the depths of shame, the good deeds a man has done before defend him." Even at the end, he couldn't escape the images of what he had helped create, still searching ancient wisdom for some kind of peace. If you've made it this far, you clearly appreciate deep dives into how great achievements can become great burdens. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week, we're exploring another brilliant mind who wished they could undo their greatest discovery. Remember, as Oppenheimer's story shows us, sometimes understanding something too well means never being able to find peace with it again.